Welcome to Good Sex at NYU, a podcast about sex, relationships, health, and mental health in a sex-positive space. So if you're looking for sometimes serious, sometimes funny, and always sex-positive discussions, then you're in the right place. I'm Danielle Elliman, Associate Director of Sexual and Relationship Respect Services at Counseling and Wellness Services. I use she, her pronouns.
And I am April Fellers, a nurse and sexual health educator at the Student Health Center. I also use she, her pronouns. We are two white, cisgender, heterosexual, female-identifying clinicians, one with a medical background and the other with mental health experience, who seek to create a space that is inclusive of all identities, backgrounds, and perspectives. Today on Good Sex, we are joined by Zabie Yamasaki, she, her, who's the founder of Transcending Sexual Trauma Through Yoga, which is an organization that offers trauma-informed yoga to survivors, consultation for universities and trauma agencies, and training for healing professionals. Zabie received her undergraduate degree in psychology and social behavior and education at UC Irvine and completed her graduate degree in higher education administration and student affairs at the George Washington University. She is a survivor, mother, partner, daughter, sister, friend, and activist. She is the author of the book Affirmation Deck and Flip Chart published by Norton called Trauma Informed Yoga for Survivors, a children's book published by Pesci called Your Joy is Beautiful: The Magic of Knowing You Are Enough, Just As You Are, and a children's deck called H is for Healing: 52 Everyday Practices to Strengthen Children's Physical, Emotional, and Mental Well-Being.
So accomplished, yes. And I really love the magic of knowing you are enough just as you are. I love that. So thank you so much for being here. This is going to be a new type of interview for us. You are our very first non-NYU guest. So we're so happy that you're our very first. And so we want to make this, a two-part interview because you have such a wealth of knowledge and experience. But we also want to know a little bit about, your personal journey. So we're going to do part 1 and part 2 of this, if that's okay with you. So.
Yes, that sounds great. I'm so honored and excited to be with you all.
I always find it really fascinating to hear folks' journey about their career and how they ended up where they are. And I think specifically because we work with students, it's really helpful for them to hear that it doesn't always work out the way that you initially thought it was going to. So if you could share a little bit more about how you came to be doing what you're doing and how you found your passion, that would be really great.
Yes, I love this question. And, my career has been birthed from such a deeply personal place as a survivor of sexual assault, also working in the anti-sexual violence movement. I think, when I went to undergrad and grad school, I always thought that my dream job was going to be working as a director of a women's center or at a sexual assault response center or doing some sort of feminist advocacy. And, for a while, I did work in positions like that for the first 10 years of my career, actually. I was working in a professional role, primarily giving presentations on sexual trauma, doing outreach events. And, as I sort of reflect on my own journey as a survivor, for me, a lot of what I experienced was the somatic impact of my trauma, the flashbacks, the insomnia, the PTSD, the nightmares, the GI issues. Trying to talk about those experiences in talk therapy for me personally was just not what I needed. And I was inspired to go through yoga teacher training, and I was doing this simultaneously while I was working on a campus. And the more I was going through yoga teacher training, the more I was learning about the impact of trauma on my nervous system. Anatomy and physiology. And then, I think so much about the trauma education I do in the community, talking about the neurobiology of trauma, talking about our survival responses. And I started to really see this intersection of these two worlds that for a long time they were very separate.
Mm.
And, this ultimately led to me writing, one day at 3 a.m. I woke up and I wrote out in my journal this 8-week curriculum. Like it was, sometimes when something is living inside your body and you just need to get it pen to paper and it needs to come out in some form. And I wrote this curriculum. I ended up, putting it together more formally and teaching it at UC Irvine. And from there, it just took on a life of its own. I think particularly at that time, around 2011, 2012, more and more universities and organizations were starting to learn about trauma-informed yoga. They were really starting to recognize that we all need to expand the scope of services that we offer survivors in their healing journey to be more holistic in nature. And, we were finding that so many survivors were starting with the trauma-informed yoga program and then feeling empowered to seek additional resources in their recovery. I think there's something incredibly powerful about first finding that safety and stability in your nervous system, and then working through all the resources that might be available to you. So I could talk about this topic all day long.
Yeah.
I imagined, in a million years that, that my career would be what it is today. I feel so grateful that I followed that light and that passion. I've never been someone that has been good at following the rules or like inside the lines. I've always been called a little bit, outside of that to, there's got to be a different way for us to look at this. And so I've always just followed that.
Yeah. And while you may not be affiliated with NYU, it sounds like you are very versed in the university and college space. And so I think that what you are sharing is really, really beneficial for our students. And
well, also, I just want to say thank you for sharing that, you have a history of, experiencing sexual harm. I think that, so many times, like, it is helpful to see people and where they're at in their journey of healing. And so I really appreciate that so many people start in different places. Sometimes it's, through yoga or through therapy or through talking to someone, just reaching out for the very first time. So I just really want to thank you for being so open and sharing that with us today.
Yeah. So it sounds like you were already doing yoga while you were starting this working journey, and I'm curious, what was your experience like the first time you took a yoga class, and then what inspired you to continue on that journey?
Oh my goodness. My very first yoga class I took, it was like, if you can imagine that there's just, maybe you're in an environment where there's so much overstimulation and there's like loud noises and just the overwhelm is so intense. And then that first yoga class I had, it was like all of those voices and that noise and the stimulation just kind of got really still. And it was such a profound experience for me to learn what it feels like to allow peace to make its way. Because I don't think I had allowed myself the opportunity to get still and enough to know that my body had been functioning in survival mode for so long that I didn't even know the difference. Like I just thought I had normalized that for so long, that way of being, just everything always felt urgent, whether it was like a crisis or somebody just emailing me. Like and it took so long for me to really start to be gentle with myself, to not shame myself for all of the ways that my body has responded. I think a lot of times survivors experience additional stigma and blame because of the ways that their body has responded with the resources that they have available. And sometimes like you don't know until you know.
Mm.
There was something so profound about that first yoga class. You know, it wasn't an instant cure, or it didn't, you know, take away from the grief or the trauma that was living inside my body, but it did start to show me that a new way of showing up was possible.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah, I'm thinking about my first yoga, and I was remembering that I had all these like preconceived notions about yoga. There are certain people that do it, and that like there was like, oh, they get like really upset. And I think it took me a long time to get there as a result of some of those things. I was like, oh, because everyone used to always ask me, oh, you must do yoga just by how I present. They're like, oh, you look like you do yoga. I'm like, what does that even mean? You know, so there's a lot of preconceived notions out there. And so I sometimes experience that when I'm doing work with people who experience sexual assault. It's like, oh, no, yoga's not really for me. And so I'm curious, like, if you've encountered that in some of your work.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's why I feel so passionate about, you know, doing the work from a trauma-informed lens, because you know, there are many survivors that might seek out yoga spaces and then feel, you know, additional harm and victimization because they don't feel like it's a place they belong, or, you know, a teacher places their hands on them without their permission, or, you know, there's mats are very close one next to each other, or there's straps hanging on the wall. There's a lot of triggers that inherently can be present in yoga spaces. And there's so much that, you know, and it's funny because I think I live in such a trauma-informed bubble sometimes that anytime I step out of that, I'm like, oh, we have a lot of work to do still. You know, I've been in yoga classes where a teacher will say, you know, plan to stay the entire time, or no water breaks, or you know, immediately your nervous system does not feel safe in that space. I really try to cultivate the opposite when I'm teaching of like, if you want to find one shape and stay there for the entire class, that would be amazing and supported. So, and always your practice, your choices are celebrated here. There's so much intention that goes into building sort of the physicality of the space. You know, integrating trauma sensitive breath work. There, you know, I remember working with a survivor who he had walked into the space, and there's a lot that I do to set up the space. I try to get there an hour beforehand to, you know, set out the affirmation cards and to put out the props if those feel supportive for folks. And you know, there was a survivor that walked in and she's running the space. And then she comes up to me and she goes, I feel like you love me, but I don't even, you don't even know me. And it was such a profound reminder for me that there's actually, it's so much more about our supportive presence, about just the way we even nurture our own nervous systems and how that impacts our ability to create this space for co-regulation in this. You know, it's I know I'm kind of talking off tangent, but there's
no, I think you're answering my question, because I think part of this question for me is really because I've experienced yoga teachers who have done things that I think have not been trauma informed, because I also live in my own little trauma informed bubble, right? I talk about it all the time on this podcast. I talk about it in workshops with students to say we need trauma informed sex and relationships, right? And so I think when I walk into a yoga studio and I have someone touch me without asking, or even call me out, like from across the room, if I'm not doing something right and someone's kind of yells at me, I'm like, I'm not a fan of that. Can we like, and so it deters me. And so I think people have had traumatic experience inside of yoga. And so I'm glad to hear that there are not just your spaces, but other spaces that like are cultivating that kind of trauma informed space, because it is, I mean, I talk about various different yoga practices all the time in my clinical work with survivors.
Yes, it is. It's so prevalent. And actually, there is an amazing organization in New York City called Exhale to Inhale that provides trauma-informed yoga classes all over New York. In fact, I was just sitting on a panel yesterday with New York City's deputy commissioner for their office to end gender-based violence.
Okay.
You were talking about, I mean, I've been in based in Los Angeles, but I'm in a New York City state of mind this week. We were just talking all about just, there's so many barriers that are present for survivors. So the more we can create access with these various modalities, the more we're creating equitable healing spaces.
Yeah. And you mentioned the co-regulation piece, and that just made me think, in my space of new motherhood and that like when a child is born, like their nervous system and the birthing parent's nervous system is like aligned, like they're essentially one and the same. And like I just think of the times like when my son is crying and I put him on my chest and like my deep breathing regulates his breath, and just thinking about that in like with patients I've worked with as a nurse, and just kind of like the looking at somebody in the eye and saying, let's breathe together, and like I'm going to breathe and you're going to breathe, and just this idea that, having that other person there to help with that regulation and is a form of love, like you're saying, and just kind of creating that space. I think it's beautiful. We all need to have somebody there to help us regulate our nervous system sometimes.
And babies are such a beautiful example of that. You described that vision so powerfully. And I've actually been thinking a lot about that. One of the first, you might see babies do this. I don't know if people will be able to see me, but this is something called Adhi Mudra. And you will see babies do this a lot. This is like one of the first gestures they do when they're little. And this is actually one of the tools that I integrate the most in my yoga classes. It's a grounding mudra. And I remember when you were little, like this was one of the first things you did to resource yourself.
That's so interesting. Because I know that like when I see babies, it's so cute when they have their thumb sort of tucked deeply into their fingers, and you think, oh, that's so adorable. And then you just want to like tuck your finger in there. But like to know that they're doing that as I had no idea. So thank you. That's like understand a little bit more about how we're first, regulating. Yeah.
And it's, also for our inner child as adults to come back to that sense of anchoring. I work with a lot of survivors who will do this when they're feeling very activated or just kind of need a moment to ground and anchor in their nervous system. And it's a really powerful practice. So much to learn from early motherhood. And
yes.
Yeah. And you named an organization here in New York, but I'm wondering, is there a movement to shift all yoga practice? Because I feel like it shouldn't just be there are certain organizations or certain places where you get trauma-informed yoga.
Yes. This is an ongoing mission that I have. If you think about it, when you go through yoga teacher training, you're getting education on anatomy and prenatal and yogic philosophy and injuries, but there's no module on trauma.
That's surprising.
So surprising. And it still feels very innovative when a yoga teacher training is reaching out to me to say, can you do one of our weekend lectures on trauma informed? And I'm always so grateful. But yes, while more and more yoga studios are understanding the importance of this, there's still so much work to do with the education starting a lot more umbrella, where this is becoming a requirement for yoga teacher training and not just sort of a specialization. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. That's what I was thinking, because I think we talk a lot, today and, sometimes in our podcast about sexual trauma, but there's so many different types of trauma, like in the body, and the ways in which like that comes out. Like in a medical field, we'll talk about you should be trauma informed, not just in a GYN clinic, but in all clinics, because like trauma, whether it's sexual assault or if it's, you know, some kind of accident, or, you know, you survived a gun shooting, you know, a mass shooting, like trauma is felt in all of us in different ways. And so it's like, why are we not doing that on a broader level in so many different areas? So yeah, I'm glad that there's some work moving forward on that.
Yeah.
There's a quote that's something like, if you're teaching yoga, you're teaching trauma survivors. You know, just that we need to always be holding that universal lens, that space that we're entering, there is trauma that's going to be present, which is why, you know, always holding a trauma-informed lens in our interactions with everybody, you know, having a little more grace and a little more kindness, and really interacting with people in a way that allows them to really feel seen and held. Such a significant impact.
Yeah. You mentioned when you were talking about how you became interested and kind of merged your passion and your profession, and about the neurobiology of trauma and kind of how that impacts our bodies. And that's kind of a big word. I'm wondering if you could kind of break that down for us, and some of what that means, and how that comes up in your work.
Yes, I talk a lot about the impact that trauma has on the brain. Especially, it's so integral for yoga teachers to have this education about, you know, why survivors may not recount details of their trauma in a linear fashion, and why, you know, asking a survivor to jump right into a trauma narrative when they're in therapy, why that may not be a place where they want to start, or why interacting with law enforcement when their nervous system is completely hijacked and they're still trying to recount details of what happened, that maybe they're not going to have a language to think about what happened. And there's a quote from my colleague, Schreiner. She says, every time you remember that trauma changes the brain, remember that healing changes the brain too.
I like that.
And it's important.
Such an important reminder, because I think we can get so stuck in that dark place that it can be really hard to see the light. And part of the beauty of neuroplasticity, which is, you know, our ability to build new neural pathways, is we're doing that oftentimes in these trauma-informed yoga classes, because so much of the work that I'm doing is really trying to remind and anchor people in their own worth and their own wholeness. Sometimes that's coming in the form of a powerful shape that we might be making with our bodies, of like that reminder to take up space, that they don't need to shrink. Sometimes that comes in the form of an affirmation around, you don't have to work yourself into exhaustion, or your productivity, your worth is not tied to your productivity. You know, we embed a lot of these mantras and affirmations and themes in the class and tie them to certain asanas. And that really allows people to embody that off of them. And that's where, you know, that neuroplasticity comes into play, and really working towards post-traumatic growth. I think one of the most powerful things for me that I witness in my work is, you know, I'll work with a survivor who maybe comes in on week 1 of an 8-week series. And then week after week, I slowly see those incremental changes. And I think what's powerful about that is healing doesn't always feel tangible. You know, sometimes sometimes it feels so slow, and we have patient with ourselves, and we can get so frustrated when we're not seeing those immediate results, and even more frustrated when we know healing isn't linear and we're sort of feeling like we're taking a few steps back and, you know, riding the ebbs and flows of it all. And when I can witness that tangible nature of sort of seeing that emotional armor come down, or seeing someone start to engage with other participants in the class when maybe they started like feeling very shut down, you know, seeing someone smile or really move through the class, not listening to me at all, really feeling so anchored in their choices and their agency. All of this contributes to the way that we're looking at healing, both the neurobiology of healing and yeah, I'm trying to describe something that is such a felt experience in the class. So it's hard to do, but I think hopefully you're getting the essence.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's so important because trauma happens in the body and in the mind. And so I think sometimes we are only focused on one. And so and they don't have to come at the same time. I think sometimes it's like where you're at. And one of my recommendations is to start with where you're at and not to have to force yourself to do something that you're not ready for. So students will come to me and I will instantly say, you don't have to repeat anything that you've experienced, right? And if someone is going to ask you, like if we're working on, referrals outside, if someone asks you to tell the whole story, that probably isn't the right therapist for you, right? If they're trauma informed, they're not going to have you go through that story. They're not going to make you in the first, second, or third time start that journey. Like that's part of the healing. That doesn't have to be the first thing. I would like to work in a frame where we are going to try to help you like lower the intensity, try to come up with some of the strategies, work in your body. How are you sleeping? Various different ways before we ever even think about processing that and working on the thoughts and feelings connected to that. So I love that, and that's why I often will use a lot of the yoga strategies. Like we're talking about some deep breaths and some centering and sometimes even some poses, your body feels that, your body, there's certain parts of your body. I have this example where someone I worked with a long time ago who always noticed that there was a certain thing about her, brushing her teeth, and there was something on a certain side, and she's like, but the trauma didn't happen, while I was brushing my teeth. It didn't happen, on this side. Nothing special. We talked, and I know her for a really long time, and it turns out the person who caused her harm had approached her right before, while she was brushing her teeth. And so it took us a really long time for us to unpack that. But in the meantime, before we, unpacked all of that, we worked with what was going on in her body when she would go to brush her teeth, right? And what was happening in her body then. And so I just think that they worked so well together because it really does focus on, calming the body when their body is reacting, and the body feels so much.
Oh, that is such a profound example of all the ways that our body remembers.
Mm-hmm.
When we can't quite remember. It took her some time to make that association, and the beautiful therapeutic relationship that she had with you to be able to kind of identify what the trigger was and where it was coming from. And, it's also so beautiful the way that movement or meditation or breath work, how that can create an avenue for processing a little more deeply. I think it's so hard for me to look at anything outside of my relationship to my nervous system because I feel like everything in my life comes back to, how am I orienting to this experience and how is this showing up in my body today? It's so beautiful that work that you did with that individual. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. Well, again, everything that you're saying, I'm just really connecting to because I feel like it's so important that we allow people to have their journey and what they need. And sometimes it's going to start with a yoga class, or it'll start with opening up to a friend or something like that. So I really just appreciate the work that you're doing.
It seems like a lot of the work that you have done up to this point is with sexual assault survivors. And, we talked about this idea of trauma-informed care for all parts of life and how trauma can be lots of different things. And I'm curious if you feel like the work that you're doing and the yoga specifically would be beneficial to people who have survived other types of trauma, if you've seen that already in your work and what that looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. I started off with this specialization of working with survivors of sexual assault, and over the years, my work has really broadened its scope. And now with the trauma-informed yoga certification trainings I teach in particular, they bring together yoga teachers, doctors, mental health professionals, folks working at the intersections of so many different experiences of trauma. And I've sort of shifted the language a little bit to be more broad based, because so much of the frameworks of what I'm teaching can be applicable to working with multiple experiences of trauma. And, as I think about sort of the foundations of trauma-informed care, this work really started within early rape crisis center and anti-domestic violence movements, from the work of Black and Brown feminists who were on the front lines doing direct service work with survivors to center their culturally affirming needs. And it's been amazing because that has now been translated as safety, trust, choice, collaboration, empowerment, and cultural competence. And so many professions are now taking it and applying it because they recognize the importance of doing their work with humanity and integrity and with compassion. And so it's really amazing just what is possible by taking this framework and applying it to contemplative spaces. And, as you were saying, Danielle, with the work that you were doing in therapy, similarly, and I think you said you're a nurse, right, April?
Mm-hmm.
We've had nurses take some of these tools and use them with trauma survivors, or, really creating that safety for them within their nervous system. We've had educators start, if they're going to be talking about something particularly activating in a lecture or in a workshop they're giving, they might, start with some few resourcing techniques. And so it's been amazing just seeing all the different ways that people are taking the tools and the practices and the frameworks and applying them accordingly to their work in the world.
Yeah, that's great that it's so applicable in so many spaces and necessary, and that everybody else is also seeing the value in kind of picking up what you're putting down in all those different spaces.
Are there some other tips that you can provide folks? I know you told us the infant hand crow. I love that. But I wonder if there's any other like small little tips that you would be willing to share with our listeners that they can do if they are feeling activated or overwhelmed in moments that are, I don't know, sometimes you're out in the public, sometimes you're at home. So different ways in which they can navigate that.
Yes, absolutely. I can take you through a few of my favorites.
Yeah.
The first one is butterfly hug, which you both might be familiar with.
Yeah.
So it's gently inviting your arms to cross your body. And if it feels comfortable and safe for you, you might rest your right cheek on top of your left palm. And maybe invite a gentle sway side to side. You can keep your eyes open or closed, whatever feels most supportive and nurturing to you. Feel free to switch sides whenever you feel ready. There's absolutely no rush. As you find that space side to side, you might gently move your way back to your center, perhaps massaging down your shoulders and bringing any love and compassion and tenderness to any parts of your body that need your care. You might massage your palms, or perhaps bring them to the back of your head for a gentle self-massage. Maybe to the temple. And if I can rest your palm on the side of your face for a compassionate face cradle, you can allow your left palm to fall wherever it lands. And maybe come back to that gentle swing. Honoring your inhales and exhales. Finding the unique pace of your own life and trusting in it. And switch sides from the left palm. And find a way that feels supportive to you. You can rub your palms together, creating a little bit of warmth, creating that gentleness, that internal light. And then rest your palms on any parts of the body that might feel activated, exhausted, or depleted. Maybe place that warmth on any parts of you that need a little extra care, tenderness. And you take in the compassion that you so freely give to others.
That's great.
Yeah. I actually only partially heard you. I was just like in my zone. I was like, oh yes, the next movement. Yes. Oh, that was lovely. Thank you for leading us in that.
And that was really nice to be able to just pause and, we can talk about this work all day long, but I think it's so powerful when people can experience the impact in their own bodies. And so for those of you listening who might be taking some of these tools with you, what we did was, self-compassion work, really. There was some self-compassion holds, there was a butterfly hug, the face cradle, the inner light meditation with, using that warmth on, any parts of the body that feel triggered or activated. So you can drop into this anytime throughout the day of just, whatever it looks like for you, whatever variations you might want to make to the practice, that's always available to you to make it your own. So thank you both for giving me the opportunity to to just drop it. It's really special.
We should have started with that.
Yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned the organization in New York that you said is focusing on trauma-informed care. We'll definitely put a link to them, the show notes that we have. Are there any, I know, definitely want to hear more about the resources that you have, any other recommendations for people who either aren't in LA, can't come to a class of yours, or aren't at a university where your programs already exist? What kinds of resources are available for them?
Yes, absolutely. There's just incredible work being done across the country. Exhale to Inhale was the organization that I mentioned that is based in New York. They offer trauma-informed classes throughout the community, as well as trauma-informed yoga certification trainings for any professionals. So if there are staff or students in your community who are wanting to learn how to kind of offer this modality or learn to integrate it in their work, I offer an 8-week yoga as healing series online. So if you want to practice with me virtually, that's always available to you, as well as our teacher training programs. And there's an incredible organization called the Breathe Network that is both international and is an international organization where all of their practitioners are holistic healing practitioners. So Chinese medicine, acupuncture, trauma-informed yoga, Reiki, I mean, you name it, that all of their practitioners are trauma informed. And you can search by geography, location, whatever the modality is. And so that's another organization that I would encourage you to check out if you're really looking for a practitioner in your area who specializes in being trauma informed. It's just a good database to kind of start with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, we'll definitely put links to all of those. Can you tell us about your books? Like, are the books, what could be a beneficial way people could utilize the books? Or is it to get to know you, share with friends, family? What would you say?
Oh, absolutely. Well, the book Trauma Informed Yoga for Survivors of Sexual Assault Practices for Healing and Teaching with Compassion is a great resource if you are a survivor or if you're a healing professional really interested in learning how to do this work in the world. It's really to be a supportive guidebook of walking you through all of the frameworks of trauma-informed yoga, learning about empowering language and agency, trauma-sensitive breath work, creating culturally affirming healing spaces, thinking about creating safety and sort of the physicality of the space. It really walks folks through all of these different aspects of the work. And then people really love the trauma-informed yoga affirmation deck. Survivors love to use that in their own healing process, both on and off the mat. We've seen therapists integrate it into sessions with clients. Yoga teachers, put them in a circle when they're teaching yoga classes. So the possibilities really are endless, but those would be two great resources if what we're talking about today is sparking an interest or passion for you. And the children's books I'm finding too are just as much for adults as they are for kids. That I've had so many adults reach out and say the H is for Healing card deck is just something that they utilize in their everyday because these were messages maybe they didn't receive when they were younger. Joy is beautiful. The magic of remembering that you're enough just as you are. It's a book exactly about that. It's about recognizing the beauty of our everyday moments. Seeing the joy in washing the dishes with my son. It seems like an ordinary moment, but there's actually so much magic that's there. So it's really about honoring the beauty of those moments. And it's a very diverse book that you'll see, families of all racial and ethnic backgrounds, of body sizes, of, it's just such a beautiful reflection of what society actually looks like. And growing up, I didn't have a lot of books where I saw people that looked like me. So that was, very important for me. In being an author and bringing these resources out to the world. So wherever you start, I think, you'll find a lot of beauty and joy and healing in all of these resources.
Sound like a lot of great resources.
Yeah, I'm really excited to get the H's for Healing deck for my baby. He's still very much a baby, but I think that it could be beneficial for him. And I think also kind of what you're saying in terms of I didn't necessarily learn a lot of these lessons growing up. And so it could be for both of us. So I don't teach him the wrong thing and, those generational cycles. And so we can learn together and heal together.
That's great. Is there anything else you want to share with our listeners about the work that you do?
Oh, I feel like we covered so much in actually such a short period of time. I would love to connect with you on Instagram. I know you'll put all my information in the show notes. So I'm just, I'm here for you to support you in your healing and teaching journey. If I can be of support or service to you, I would be so honored.
Well, thanks so much for sharing about your work and your passion. It's so important. What you're doing. And so I really appreciate all of that you're doing for people who experience any kind of trauma. So listeners, I hope you will tune into part 2 of our interview with Zabie, because we're going to be talking a little bit more personal about sex and relationships. So tune in to part 2.
If you have questions about the podcast or anything we talked about today, please feel free to reach out to us at goodsex.podcast@nyu.edu. This email address is monitored during business hours and may take 3 to 4 days for follow-up. We are definitely open to critical and thoughtful feedback, as we didn't cover everything in this episode and might have said something that was inaccurate or that had a negative impact on someone. If you have questions about your sexual health and are an NYU student, you can connect with our Student Health Center sex expert at sexpert@nyu.edu or schedule an appointment through the Student Health Center portal. Look at our show notes for additional information and resources, including organizations, articles, books, and videos.
If you have urgent mental health concerns, safety issues, or you are worried that someone might have caused harm to you, or that you might have caused harm to someone, then you can contact NYU's Confidential Wellness Exchange at 212-443-9999. Chat with them using their mobile app or email them at wellness.exchange@nyu.edu. For anyone, NYU or non-NYU listeners, you can call the National Sexual Assault Hotline at 1-800-656-4673, the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233, or the National Mental Health Hotline. Simply dial 988 from anywhere in the U.S.
Thanks for listening, and tune in to our next episode where we continue to talk about good sex at NYU. Subscribe to the podcast to hear all of our quickies and interviews with NYU community members. Thanks to our content contributors for this episode, Bernadette Kerr, Alyssa LaFosse, Dr. Dominic Baini-Amisa, Zoe Raguzios, and to our health promotion team, Anna Genova, Jenny Mellum, Parade Stone, and Arna Dixit, and to Gotham Studios and Karen Ortman. Good sex.